Has worked extensively with the LGBTQ adolescents and adults in both pastoral and social services capacity. Currently, Assistant Professor of Social Work at the University of St. Joseph's in Connecticut. He provides training in health and mental health care settings and clinical consultation around the world with transgendered and gender-variant children, youth, and adults. His clinical practice has focused on transgender, gender-diverse youth, and their family. Ordained with the Metropolitan Community Church, Elijah also preaches and provides workshops with faith communities and other organizations. An out trans man, author of Transgender Children and Youth, Cultivating Pride and Joy with Families in Transition. He lives in Connecticut with his partner and is the proud father of 3 amazing young people. So I'd like to present Dr. Nealy.
You hear me? No, not on the mic. Okay.
There you go. Yep.
Not yet. Well, maybe I'll start off there. Can you hear me now? No. You said just...
He said just touch it. I'll work on that. You can use the podium if you like.
All right, great. Yeah, because when he did it before, he just sort of said it was like on mute.
Yep.
So I got my start street preaching in Philadelphia when I was younger than any of you. So I do know how to project. So I grew up in a very fundamentalist Baptist background, just 20 minutes from here, in a independent fundamentalist Baptist church where they thought the Southern Baptists were liberal. Because they belong to a denomination, and if you belong to a denomination, that would mean you'd have to compromise at some point, and any compromise is wrong. So that's where I grew up, and the Salvation Army was my transitional object out of fundamentalism. And I thought at 17 or so that the Salvation Army was incredibly progressive because they had ordained women equally with men since the mid-1800s, and they cared about more than where people were going when they died. They cared about whether families had enough food on the table, whether they had clothes for the kids, and they were engaged in lots of social service ministries. And to me, that was exciting, and it's shaped a lot of my own journey since then. That I have a degree in social work, but also have a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And I'd like to say I got a great clinical education years ago at Columbia, but my social justice education happened at Union. And but those sort of twin pieces and thinking about how to integrate spirituality and issues of faith in my clinical practice and creating a space for people to explore that has been a really important part of my clinical work. And I think a way in which that's particularly been relevant in a lot of the work I've done with LGBTQ families and individuals, because of the ways so many people in that community have felt shut out or marginalized by faith communities, and the ways that affects their childhood, adolescent, sort of faith development, their ability as an adult to find a sense of spirituality and faith that feels right for them or is healthy for them. And so I've done a lot of work around that in the context of LGBT communities as well. And so for those of you for whom that's an interest, and even if it's not, I would encourage you to really think about how you create spaces for that and how our assessment with families opens the door to that conversation, right? Are there ways in which your spirituality or sense of faith or involvement in religion are important to you, right? Because I think for many people, it's a real source of strength and resilience. And sometimes, less so I think in family therapy maybe, but too often that sort of problem-saturated narrative is what our families come in with, and all the ways they haven't been able to figure things out. But many, many times, spirituality and faith is a real resource for people. And so that's just an aside from today's topic. But I really like being able to talk about my work with transgender children, young people, gender diverse. In my bio there, it used gender variant and gender diverse later. I don't use gender variant much anymore. One of the things that happens in marginalized communities is the dominant culture often names you. And as marginalized communities build a sense of self-esteem and pride and community and become more empowered, they often begin to name themselves, right? And say those names you labeled us with don't fit. And so that's true in LGBTQ communities as well. So early on in DSM 3 and 4, gender variant would have been used to talk about kids with diverse gender expression outside what's normatively expected for a boy or a girl. But gender variant, pretty pejorative, right? And so moved a little bit to gender nonconforming, but today much more gender diverse, gender expansive, gender creative even. Is language that you'll hear used as best practices. So I'll talk a little bit about younger children, about adolescents. We'll look at a case vignette or two around work with adolescents and families, and then a little bit about the work with the families, which for me is as important as the work with the young people themselves. And more research is documenting that family acceptance of LGBTQ youth is the critical mediating variable for young adult risk factors. And so for me, that means the family work is always essential when we're working with trans and gender fluid, gender queer, gender diverse young people. And I'll come back to those terms in a minute. But I slid your slides around a little bit, and I want to start with this brief video, which to me is a fairly recent video. Some of the parents in this video I know, but it's a video I think that really shows both parents who have worked very hard to not only be supportive and accepting, but many of these parents on the front lines as advocates for their children and other children. But it also shows me what our goal is in working with families and gender diverse or trans youth, and the ways in which we want families to be able to really embrace and nurture their children without the kids internalizing shame about who they are, right? And so, let's see if I can make this.
Ready, take a deep breath. Ready, take a deep breath. Sit down.
Even if it doesn't feel true, remember that's what an affirmation is. We say something because we want to work on feeling good about ourselves, okay?
You can hear it okay?
I am curious.
I'm curious.
I am hope.
I am hope. Say, I am love.
I am love.
I am loved.
I am loved. I am loved deeply and unconditionally, just as I am.
I'm a drummer.
I'm a drummer.
I am the king of all kings.
I am the king of all kings.
I am courageous.
I am courageous.
I am magic.
I'm magic.
I'm a boy.
I'm a boy.
I get back up.
I get back up. I can get back up again.
This body
This body is strong.
I am ferocious.
I am who I am.
I am who I am.
I know who I am.
I know who I am. I am beautiful. I am beautiful.
I am young and I can change the world.
I am young and I can change the world.
I am epic.
I am epic. I am a turtle.
I am a turtle.
I believe in acceptance for everyone.
I believe in acceptance for everyone. And then say moon baby.
You are my moon baby. That's not an affirmation, though.
Yes, it is.
All right.
These are good. Wait, the snakes celebrate their birthday.
So for me, that's what it looks like when young children whose gender expression gender identity may not be what's stereotypically expected, but are being raised in an environment where they can express who they are and be supported and affirmed for that. The opposite of that is kids growing up internalizing lots of shame about ways that they're perceived to be different, and that difference being perceived to not be okay. And so when I work with families, regardless of whether that child is identifying with a gender other than the sex assigned at birth, whether it's about their gender expression being different, if we don't know that yet, my work with the parents is always around creating enough space for that child to be who they are, express themselves as they are without being shamed. And the rest of it, particularly with young kids, we often figure out along the way, right? But that's a piece of it. So it's possible we don't have to spend much time on this, I'm hoping that, but I use this graphic a lot. I use it with families even, with young people sometimes, as an educational tool. And there are newer versions of it out that I haven't uploaded yet into the PowerPoint. But if you Google it, it'll pop right up. And it's a great tool for helping families as well as young people, sometimes even kids, understand the differences between these four aspects of who they are. And many times, people still don't understand these as distinct aspects of who we are. So our biological sex, when I talk about that, with families and youth, I'm talking about what the delivery doctor said the minute you came into the world, right? Boy or girl. And most of the time that's clear. About 1 in 2,000 births, it's not so clear. And there may be ambiguous genitalia, and the doctor is not sure which of those two boxes that infant belongs in. And the language today for that is an intersex condition. A child's born with an intersex condition or adult living with an intersex condition. Sometimes you'll see in the acronym LGBTQI, the I stands for intersex when it's there, but if you talk with adults with intersex conditions, some of them view that more as a medical condition that they live with, whereas others might view that as part of their identity and put the I there. But not everybody who was born with an intersex condition would put the I in the acronym. And I have worked with families with young people with intersex conditions. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but in thinking about you interacting with families, historically, the protocol when a child was born with ambiguous genitalia was that the doctors would make their best guess and surgically alter that infant's genitalia so they looked normative. And there is literally a medical length that a penis has to be considered a valid penis on an infant. And if it's shorter than that, it would be removed, a vagina created, the child raised as a girl. It's important that you know that because because historically that surgery would happen without even telling parents. Or not told, it would happen and then tell the parents. Today the parents are generally told, but some recent data that I read said that 75 to 80% of those infants, surgery is still performed on them as infants. And if you talk with adults who were born with intersex conditions, what they are consistently saying at this point is we would rather that not have been done when we were infants. We would rather have been involved in that decision about whether or not our bodies were surgically altered, right? And so that's an important piece as family therapists because you could have families with a newborn child, 6-month, 12-month-old who's born with an intersex condition and be grappling with that decision. And there is literature out there, but I think the most important piece is knowing that most adults would say they would have rather had that information shared in appropriate ways as a young child, but then as they moved into adolescence, even toward adulthood, that they would have had the opportunity to be part of that conversation. And a piece of that in their feedback is that the doctor's best guess is not always right, right? And so sometimes a penis that's removed and a child raised as a girl is not how their gender identity emerges. And so now, though, their body's been altered. And the other reason is that the surgery that's done often because of the surgery and removal of erotic tissue, means that those adults are not able to have as rich a sexual life and sexual intimacy as if they would have if their genitalia had not been surgically altered. And many of them are saying as adults, we would rather negotiate this with our partners, even if our body parts aren't normative, and have a rich, intimate sexual life than to not be able to have that with someone we love. So I bookmarked that a little bit. But biological sex, about often body parts, anatomy, gender identity, the dotted line goes to the genderbread person's head, because gender identity is about our own internal knowledge, understanding of who we are in terms of gender. So male or female, both or neither, as we work with more and more young people that are breaking open that binary construct. And for most people in the world, their gender identity as they grow up matches the sex the delivery doctor announces. But for transgender people, there's some ways in which their own understanding of who they are around gender does not line up exactly with the sex assigned at birth. Gender expression, people often confuse it, but gender expression, all the different ways we express who we are in the world as men, women, both, or neither. And gender expression and gender identity not the same, right? And non-normative gender expression in kids, gender diverse expression, does not necessarily equal that child will grow up to identify as trans, right? Sometimes early childhood, early elementary, gender expression, so a 5-year-old, 8-year-old boy whose interests are more stereotypically feminine may or may not grow up to be trans, right? May just be exploring gender, may grow up to be an adolescent young man, an adult man whose gender expression is more feminine than what's normatively masculine in our society, but not necessarily trans, right? Or not necessarily even gay, which is another assumption, right? So that's part of the assessment process working with families. And gender expression, in white Western culture in the US, we have fairly clear ideas about what's acceptable feminine gender expression, what's acceptable masculine gender expression, but those norms have varied over time and they vary across cultures, right? So the white Western US norm of what's expected for men or women has not been the same forever, even in the US. 100 years ago, pink was a male color. It was a boy's color. It was considered too bold, too in your face for the more delicate sex to wear, right? So they changed historically. 100 years ago, those of you that identify as women wouldn't be here in slacks. The gender expression for women, that norm has changed, right? And in sort of US Anglo cultures, men who are perceived as straight don't often have much physical contact or expression of affection, but in Latin and some Mediterranean cultures, men might walk arm in arm, they might kiss when they greet each other, and that would be considered normatively masculine behavior or gender expression. So that's an important piece to talk about with families sometimes too. And sexual orientation, again, sometimes gets conflated, but sexual orientation, when I talk with adolescents, it's about who we think is hot. And in a recent documentary on the National Geographic Channel that Katie Couric hosted, called Gender Revolution, one of the individuals there talked about sexual orientation is about who we go to bed with, gender identity, who we go to bed as. So some ways of thinking about that. I was just talking about this a little bit, but families may come in because they have younger children whose gender expression is diverse in some way. It doesn't conform to what's stereotypically accepted. And there's more latitude in Western cultures for girls to have more masculine gender expression, yes? What would be a sometimes affectionate term for young girls in jeans and t-shirts and ball caps? Tomboy, right? And so sometimes that even an affectionate thing. But often as that young girl moves into adolescence, she's supposed to femme it up more, not carry that tomboy stuff. But are there any affectionate terms for 6, 8, 10, 12-year-old boys whose gender expression is more feminine? Sissy is not really affectionate, is it? What do you think the difference is? Why there's more room for tomboys but no room for feminine gender expression in young boys? Any thoughts about that?
In a patriarchal society.
What's that?
Maybe being in a patriarchal society.
In what sense?
In that males are more valued.
Okay.
In some contexts. Male characters. So
I think culturally we also allow girls a little bit more fluidity
Mhm.
with gender expression. Versus with boys is once they express more feminine, then it's kind of a marker, and from then on they're labeled in some
Right,
being more
right.
feminine or.
And it's a marker that reflects something not okay, something even pathological, right? And for me, the only reason that I see around that, why those norms are so different, is about patriarchy and misogyny, right? And so it's okay for girls to want to be like boys, because that's valued, and it's kind of like moving up. But it's not okay at all for boys to have anything remotely feminine about who they are or their expression, because we all know that being a woman is less than being a man, right? And so a boy with any kind of feminine gender expression is looked down on. And so for me, that very much about misogyny, and that no man in his right mind in the US and some other places would want to be anything like a woman. So when you hear that, it should upset you, all right? In kids, gender variance or gender diversity may just be diverse gender interests, right? So a 6-year-old boy that likes Disney princesses and the colors pink and purple, that may just be who he is at 6. May not be who he is at 8, 10, 12, 18. It may just be who he is in that moment. And I've worked with some young boys whose gender expression when they were younger was more diverse, and they did grow up to be cisgender straight men. Right? So maybe it may just be gender diversity. Sometimes those young children with gender diverse behavior in childhood do grow up to identify as lesbian or gay, and a small percentage, though we don't really have good data on this yet, grow up to be trans. And the research that was done historically was almost all done with gender variant boys, because the world was more worried about gender variant boys and did not want them to grow up to be homosexuals, let alone transgender. And so much of that early research didn't differentiate in the sample between young boys whose gender expression was feminine and young boys who identified as trans. And they're a matter of self-assertion, right? So some young kids, gender diverse behavior, but I've also worked with families who have said to me when their child comes in at 4, 5, or 6, from 2.5 to 3 on, our son was telling us, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. How come people keep calling me a girl? And so they're a clear self-assertion about identity, right? And historically, the treatment approach was to pathologize and correct that behavior. I've worked with families who had seen other mental health professionals, one with a 6-year-old child assigned male at birth. They'd seen a psychologist for a year at that point in an urban area, but what they had been told when they brought that child in at age 5 was that they should correct any feminine gender expression, nothing with girls' colors in it, no girls' play toys, no dolls, no girl playmates anymore, only boys toys, spend more time with dad, mom step out of the picture. If your kid says, I'm a girl, you correct and say, no, you're not, you were born a boy, you'll always be a boy. And by the time they got to me a year later, they had a 6-year-old who was actively suicidal, right? And that 6-year-old, over the course of the next year, the parents and I did assess, was clearly expressing a feminine gender identity, clearly identified as a girl. That was their own knowledge of who they were, regardless of the sex assigned at birth. And a year later, that child did transition going into 2nd grade, socially transition. So, and is a amazingly beautiful 10-year-old today, and very, very happy. So I just want to touch on this a little bit, but some language. Trans man means someone assigned female at birth, but who identifies as a man. Trans woman, someone assigned male at birth who identifies as a woman. Cisgender, a word that's used today often to talk about those of you who are not transgender, right? So cisgender, when your gender identity lines up with the sex assigned at birth. When I'm working with young people, I often use transgender in a more narrow way for those young people who do identify with a gender identity other than the sex assigned at birth. When I'm using language like gender diverse, gender expansive, or creative, it's more about gender expression than identity. And today, many young people using language like gender queer, gender fluid, sometimes agender, meaning neither male or female boxes fit. Bigender, I experience myself, know myself to be both male and female, or non-binary. And again, that binary worldview or construct of everyone is either male or female, younger people more and more busting that open. A couple of years ago, I presented at the campus of State University of New York Purchase, which is one of the more liberal, artsy SUNY campuses, and I had a couple of clients who were undergraduate students there, and they were at great pains to tell me before I presented that I needed to understand that my way of being transgender, moving from one box to the other, was old school now. And that they had 2 large active trans student groups on campus, and almost all of the college students in those groups identified as gender queer, gender fluid, or non-binary. So that's where things are moving, right? So adolescents, young adults, much more embracing fluidity and not wanting to be put into one box or another. And when you think about it, again, the dominant culture sort of creates those boxes, right? In the US Census, the dominant culture created a box Hispanic. And many people who check that box, and some refuse to check the box, simply because the box does not encapsulate who they are, right? Or people that have grown up in biracial or multiracial families, right? What box do you pick? None of the boxes work, right? And so it's what many younger people are saying about sex and gender, that the boxes that have existed simply don't fit who we are. Non-binary youth, I think, have some particular challenges, as opposed to trans youth that do transition from the sex assigned at birth to their gender identity. And a lot of it, particularly in young people, young adults, not being taken seriously. Many times families, providers, why can't you just pick a box? Why do you have to make things so complicated? In the last year, a court in Oregon and several courts in California ruled that an individual who identified as non-binary can have that designation on their driver's license now, on their identity documents. And in fact, last week I heard the news that the Oregon State DMV announced that it would now, starting July 1, issue driver's licenses with an M, an F, or an X for non-binary or another gender. And that's huge. That's one state in the US, right? And there are a couple of countries where that's true. I don't have a lot of time here, but you've got that link. And again, I use this a lot when I'm working with adolescents. Incredible portraits of young people who identify as non-binary or more gender fluid. And most of them young people of color, but really showing the range of ways that someone might express their gender not fitting into a particular box. And when I do trainings, I think this is particularly true for parents and clinicians who are sort of above 30, 35, but oftentimes growing up in a world where there is a very binary construct and not comfortable with fluidity, right? And really, it's our work to have to get comfortable, right? So those are, I think, those are some of my premises. I gave you the slide about pronouns, so some non-binary young people using gender-neutral pronouns, some of them using plural pronouns to describe themselves. And just want to bookmark that transgender and cisgender people, all of us in this room, have both a gender identity and a sexual orientation. And so trans women that are attracted to other women might use the label lesbian. They might not use labels at all. Trans men attracted to other men might talk about themselves as being gay. Trans women attracted to men, trans men attracted to women might identify as straight. And trans people, and particularly young people, might identify as bisexual, asexual, not really having a sexual orientation or much interest in sex, celibate, and pansexual. That familiar term? So oftentimes young people, sometimes adults, but young people talking about sexual orientation that's broader than the binary construct of bisexual. Right? Because bisexual has historically meant attracted to men and women, maybe simultaneously at various points in the life cycle, but pansexual, really embracing not only sexual orientation, but gender identity, gender expression. So I worked with one 16-year-old cisgender woman who identified as pansexual, and when I asked her to tell me more about what that meant for her, what she said was that she was attracted to masculinity and to masculine energy. And it didn't matter to her whether that masculine energy came from a cisgender straight man, a cisgender gay man, a butch dyke or an agey woman, or a trans man. What she was attracted to was that kind of masculine energy. And the body parts were not the most relevant piece. So again, that really thinking beyond binary constructs on levels of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And the other piece that I'd say to you is that anytime I'm talking with someone, even if it's a term I'm familiar with, like pansexual, I almost always follow when I may ask someone to describe how you identify with the question, tell me more about what that means for you. Because that 16-year-old cisgender young woman's definition of pansexual would not necessarily be the client that came in after that definition, right? And so if it's a term you've never heard, you can totally ask, tell me more about what that means for you, but even if it's a term you have heard, it's worth asking, tell me more about what that means for you. Because our understandings of language vary. Any questions about those terms or definitions? So, in touching a little bit about trans adolescence, so some young children do clearly assert a gender identity that's transgender. They're not going to use that word transgender likely, but do identify with a gender other than the sex assigned at birth. But the second most common time when trans identity emerges is often when a young person is moving into puberty or adolescence. Any thoughts about why that would emerge at that point? And sometimes emerges very fiercely, passionately, strongly, and emerges with high risks already.
Well, just because that's typically the time like secondary sex characteristics develop.
Right.
You're in some ways put into this box.
Right. And the box becomes clearer and clearer as you move into puberty. So young kids, an 8-year-old kid, pretty gender neutral from the outside, right? In clothes, you could have a short haircut, boy clothes, and that 8-year-old would be read as a boy when you go through the register at the grocery store. But if that 8-year-old has long hair, some curls in it, a dress, likely to be read as a young girl, right? But as you move into puberty, secondary sex characteristics make our bodies much more gendered, right? And so for many adolescents who might have had some sense that they were gender different, maybe not, puberty is often, many times, a moment of panic. And sometimes it's a moment of, I hadn't thought much about gender as a kid. But now, like, my body's changing, right? Or now it's really clear who I'm going to be when I'm an adult. And some trans adolescents I've worked with held the belief as a young kid that when they grew up, they would be the gender they knew they were inside. I had one 14-year-old trans boy who, when I asked him to tell me a little bit about his experience of gender when he was younger, said, well, you know, every year when you have that birthday cake and they put the candles on it, and you know how if you blow off all the candles and you make a wish, like your wish will come true? Well, every year, before I blew out the candles, I wished I'd wake up as a girl or as a boy the next morning. And then said to me, but it never happened. As if this still puzzled him at 14, right? That it hadn't happened. And so really held that belief that when I grew up, somehow this is possible. And so gender dysphoria, which means a level of distress about the ways someone's body or gender identity doesn't line up with the sex assigned at birth. Gender dysphoria often escalates as a young person heads into puberty, and raises lots of risks for things that you may be familiar with. Very important with trans adolescents, paying attention to whether or not they've begun taking hormones, masculinizing or feminizing hormones on their own. Many times, and maybe more so young trans women, but also young trans guys, will access hormones on the streets from an older trans person who orders them online, and be taking hormones already without any medical supervision. And that very risky. In terms of not knowing what you're getting on the street, not being medically monitored, so we know how your body is metabolizing the testosterone or estrogen, and sometimes those hormones being injected and shared needles involved, right? At parties where trans youth and young adults are injecting themselves with hormones together. And the same true for young trans women, many times adolescents, young adults, with injections of silicone. So silicone injections to create more breast development, right, or hips. And we can think about from a maybe middle class or more affluent socioeconomic background, why would anybody do that, knowing the medical risks of that? But the reality is for poor young trans women without much access to health insurance or whose parents are not supportive of their transition, if they're already socially transitioning and moving through the world as a young woman, silicone and hormones is not only about emotional quality of life, but sometimes literal physical safety.
Due to the hugely prevalent incidence of